Our scripture passage this week is from the book of Exodus. This is chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations." For a little over a month now, we have been spending time in Matthew's Gospel. So to give a little bit of a review or a summary, we started with the parable of the sower. Brian Ward preached on that passage. And then we moved to the parable of the weeds and the wheat. Then we read about Jesus walking across the windy sea to his disciples, and he called out to them in that story by saying, "I am." And then we saw Jesus's interaction with a Canaanite woman whose faith impressed Jesus so much that she was able to persuade him to heal her daughter, even though he said that he had come to first reach out to the people of Israel. So today we are taking a pretty significant detour back from the Gospel of Matthew, all the way back to Exodus. And I am not sure if the planners of the lectionary schedule, that's what we follow here for our sermons, if the planners thought about this, but it is actually very fitting that Exodus is the Old Testament reading for when the Gospel reading is Matthew. Because out of all the Gospel writers, Matthew is the one who portrays Jesus as a new Moses figure. In Matthew, Jesus spends a lot of time on mountains, which seems kind of like a trivial detail, but it's not. That is meant to call back to Moses and the law that he receives on Mount Sinai. And in Matthew, Jesus is the authoritative and the ultimate interpreter of the Mosaic law. And he says, actually, in the gospel, that he is the fulfillment of that law. So today, we go back to Exodus, and we read about God's call to Moses. And I'm guessing most of us are probably familiar with the general contours of the story. But I want to start by giving a very, very brief summary of what has come before the story leading up to the passage today. So hundreds and hundreds of years prior to this moment of Moses in the burning bush, Moses' ancestor, Jacob, and his family migrate to Egypt, and they do that to escape a famine. And over time, Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, they keep increasing in numbers. And this worries the Egyptian rulers. They feel threatened by this. So they think that the Israelites are becoming too numerous and too strong and powerful. And so they decide to make the Israelites their slaves. And the Egyptians treat the Israelites very brutally. They go so far even to order the killings of all the male Israelite infants who were born. So that is the situation that Moses is born into. And when he's born, his mother, in an attempt to save his life, she puts him in a basket and she puts him in the Nile River. And it just so happens that Pharaoh's own daughter discovers him in the river, and she decides that she is going to keep Moses and raise him for herself. That's all we know about Moses' childhood. The next time we meet up with him, he is an adult. But it seems that as he's gotten older, he has noticed how the Egyptians are treating the Israelites. And one day he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite slave. And he gets angry and he kills that Egyptian and he buries him in the sand. And to escape punishment for this, Moses flees to the land of Midian, where he doesn't know anybody. And when he gets there, he finds a wife and he starts a completely new life there in this new place. And he becomes a shepherd. And one day he is tending his flock beyond or behind the wilderness. And when he's out there, God speaks to him out of a burning bush. And the very first word that God calls out to Moses is Moses' own name. He says, Moses, 2 times. And Moses responds, here I am. And this might seem like a trivial detail, calling out Moses' name. But in this story of Moses' life and of Moses' transformation from kind of an outlaw shepherd into a prophet, what we see in the story is a person becoming who God has intended him to be. So we see Moses' identity forming or being forged. So it is very important that God calls out to him by his given name. And we'll see in this story that names are very important, actually, and they are connected to very core questions of identity and who we are. So as I was thinking about Moses and the very little that we learn about him before this moment, I was thinking, I bet Moses, throughout his life, has probably struggled with knowing who he is. As an Israelite who is essentially forced into adoption by Pharaoh, the person who has enslaved his people, the people that he comes from. And then, in a crazy twist of fate, becoming part of Pharaoh's own family. You can imagine how confusing and disorienting that would be. Probably felt like an outsider to the Egyptians, but also an outsider to the Israelites, not really fitting in. So he was in a unique, confusing, and I would guess very alienating situation. And these questions about identity and this theme of identity, it pops up throughout this story. So for example, right after Moses kills that Egyptian and buries him, after that, he encounters two Israelites, part of the same people, who are fighting with each other, and he feels the need to try to intervene between this argument that they're having. And he says, you shouldn't be fighting, you are part of the same people. And anybody remember what the Israelite says to him?
He's going to kill us too.
Right, he says that. But first,
who made you a judge over us?
Right, yeah, he says, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? So basically, who are you to intervene in our affair here? You're not one of us. You have no authority or legitimacy in this situation. So even when Moses identifies with the Israelites, and he's, trying to be a positive force in that community, trying to help them, even there, his identity is called into question. And you get a sense that there is a confusion there, and maybe a sense of frustrated purpose. He wants to be of use, but it's not working. And so, of course, he flees to this neutral territory, Midian. And in the wilderness, in a deserted place, God calls out to him by his name. So God knows who he is, even if Moses doesn't know who God is. But God doesn't just identify Moses, God also discloses God's own identity to him. So God says, I am the God of your father, actually. I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. These are Moses's ancestors. I always get descendants and ancestors. So his biological, ancestral identity is intertwined here with a kind of spiritual or existential identity. So it seems like God is saying to him, in a way, I am actually where you come from. I am who you are from. I was there all the way back, way, way back in your past. And if you accept this call from me, I am also your future. So it's a kind of almost existential homecoming for Moses. And this homecoming and this discovery of his identity, it is rooted in God's call on Moses' life. So God says, I have seen my people, I have seen the Israelites, I have seen how they're suffering, and I am going to deliver them and liberate them. And so come, I will send you to deliver my people. And isn't this kind of what Moses, in his misguided and ineffective way, was trying to do when he killed the Egyptian, maybe subconsciously? Lashing out at that injustice in an impulsive way. But now, God is inviting him and is calling him to do this the real way, alongside of God. So it's sort of like a redemption of Moses' passion. Moses responds, though, sounds familiar. Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So here, he's echoing that earlier question that the Israelite asked him, right? When they asked him, who are you? Who made you judge or ruler over us? So this scene is a kind of answer to that question. And in my opinion, God's answer to this question is one of the most revealing parts of the story. So Moses asks, who am I to do this? And how does God answer him? He says, I will be with you. So God does not say, Moses, don't worry, you will be great. You're talented, You're strong, you're very smart, just believe in yourself. No, God says, I am going to be with you. So Moses's truest and deepest identity, or his self, right? The answer to his question, who am I, is found in his relation to God. So it's what will give his life its ultimate purpose. God will direct him, and God will give him the power to do what he needs to do. And later, Moses says, he says this many times, but please don't make me do this. I'm slow of speech. I am not an eloquent person. I am not made to be a leader or a representative of anything. And again, God doesn't say, no, Moses, you're a really good speaker. He says, who do you think gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? And so we see Moses' purpose and his identity and his ability to embody God's call in his life. This is fulfilled through his relationship to God. If you're familiar with the rest of the story, you know that this relationship Moses has with God, or Yahweh, it is not a simple relationship. It is very complicated. Moses argues with God a lot. He says, I don't want to do this, many times. He even persuades God to make Aaron, his brother, the one who does most of the talking, which is funny. And I think this tells us something about God's identity and God's character. God doesn't force Moses to do anything. God doesn't say, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, and if you refuse, I'll kill you. In fact, I thought about this a lot, actually. God didn't need Moses at all. God could have done all of this without any help from anybody. And yet, this is the way that God wants to do it for some reason. And it's almost endearing. Hearing these conversations between Moses and God. It's like a parent speaking to a child, giving some concessions when that's going to make things easier, speaking to them on the child's level in a language they understand. So I think there's a lot for us to take from this story. Maybe this is true for you, I don't know. But as I get older and I have, a tiny, tiny bit more perspective on my life, where I come from, I think more and more about that question that Moses asks over and over. Who am I? How did I become the person that I am? Did I really have any control over any of it? We like to think we do. Do I like the person that I am? What can or should I change about myself? I think these are questions that we ask ourselves as we get older. But in the story, when Moses asks, who am I? Yahweh's answer is about Yahweh. God says, I will be with you. That's the answer. Meaning it is not Moses' job to construct an identity for himself. His identity and his purpose are discovered and directed through this developing relationship that he has with God. And it's a relationship that God actually wants for some reason. And I think the same is true of us. Amen.